The night was quiet, the streets dimly lit by flickering lamps and the glow of distant shops. A decorated black veteran walked down the sidewalk, his posture straight, his steps calm. He carried himself with quiet dignity. Even though his clothes were simple and his boots had seen better days, anyone who looked closely could see the pride in his eyes. The strength of a man who had faced battles most people could never imagine. But to the local cops on patrol that night, he was just another man walking alone. Their cruiser slowed as they noticed him. The red and blue lights flashed, breaking the stillness of the street. The sound of the siren made a few passers-by turn their heads. The veteran stopped and turned calmly, his hands visible, his face steady. He had nothing to hide, nothing to fear, so he thought. The officers stepped out of the car, their boots heavy against the pavement. One of them smirked as he eyed the veteran from head to toe. "Where are you headed, sir?" he asked, but his tone carried no respect. It was sharp, suspicious. As if the man standing before him was already guilty of something, the veteran kept his voice calm. "Just walking home," he said. "I live not far from here." Instead of easing the situation, his calm words seemed to irritate the officers. "Out this late?" One of them muttered, "Doesn't look like you belong around here." The veteran raised an eyebrow, his lips tightening. He had heard such words before. During his years of service, and even after, he chose not to argue. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his military ID, holding it out with a steady hand. "I served this country for years," he said firmly. "I'm a veteran." The officers glanced at the ID, then laughed. One of them shook his head. "Anybody can carry a fake card," he scoffed. "You don't look like someone who fought for this country." Their laughter echoed in the night, sharp and cruel. A couple walking by stopped at the corner, whispering to each other, sensing that something wasn't right. The veteran's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. He had faced worse than this battlefields. Explosions, nights without food or sleep. Compared to that, these men's words were just noise. Still, the disrespect stung. He looked them in the eye and said quietly, "I've bled for this land. I've carried brothers off the battlefield. I've worn the flag with honor. That ID is not fake." But the officers weren't listening. Their smirks grew wider. "Why don't you open your sack?" one of them demanded, pointing at the bag slung over the veteran's shoulder. "What's in there?" "Stolen goods." The veteran looked down at his old duffel, the same one he had carried for years. Inside were only his belongings, some clothes, medals wrapped in cloth, a few personal keepsakes. He held the strap tightly, refusing to let them. "Touch it. This is mine," he said firmly. "There's nothing illegal here." The tension thickened. A small crowd began to gather. Drawn by the flashing lights, some held up phones, recording the scene. The veteran noticed the cameras, but said nothing. His calmness never wavered, though inside his chest, anger burned. He had fought to protect the freedom of the very officers who now mocked and questioned him. And yet, here he was treated like a criminal for simply walking home. One of the officers stepped closer, invading his space. "We'll see about that," he muttered. His hand moved toward the veteran's arm, ready to cuff him. The veteran took a deep breath. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. His words were not a plea, but a warning. The officer laughed. "The only mistake here is you thinking we'll believe your little soldier's story." The crowd murmured. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered, "He really is a veteran. I've seen him before," but their voices were drowned out by the arrogance of the officers. The veteran stood tall, refusing to bow his head. He looked straight at them, his voice steady as stone. "I carried the uniform with honor. I carried the flag with pride. And now you treat me like this." His words made the crowd grow restless. People began recording more closely, sensing that what they were witnessing was not just an arrest, but an injustice. The officers ignored the growing attention. One of them shoved the veteran slightly. Forcing his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs echoed in the night. The veteran winced, but did not fight. He knew too well what resistance could cost him. He kept his eyes fixed on the crowd instead, letting them see the truth in his face, letting them record the shame that was unfolding as they pushed him toward the cruiser. The veteran glanced once more at his bag, lying on the ground. His medals, his documents, the symbols of his service all left behind in the dirt. For a moment, his chest tightened, not from fear of what was happening, but from the bitter taste of betrayal. He had once believed his uniform protected him, but tonight it was clear his service meant nothing to these men. The doors of the cruiser opened with a metallic thud. The officers pushed him inside roughly. His head hit the edge, but he said nothing. He simply sat, his hands cuffed, his eyes steady on the flashing lights outside. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. More phones pointed toward him. Capturing the injustice, he knew then that his story was not ending here. Something bigger was coming. Something none of these officers expected. And as the cruiser pulled away, carrying him toward the precinct, the air was heavy with tension. The people who had witnessed it whispered among themselves, some angry, some shocked. All of them knew this was no ordinary stop. This was the beginning of a storm that would shake more than just a single street. It would shake the entire system. The precinct was buzzing with noise when the cruiser pulled up. The flashing lights faded as the officers dragged the black veteran out of the car. His wrists still bound in cuffs, his shoulders stiff. He did not resist. He walked with the same calm dignity that he carried on the street. But inside, his heart ached not from fear, but from the bitter sting of disrespect as they pushed him. Through the glass doors, a few officers at the desk glanced up. Some smirked, others looked curious. One leaned back in his chair and muttered, "What's this one for?" The arresting officer laughed, claims he's a war hero, says he's a veteran. Can you believe that? The others chuckled, shaking their heads as though the very idea was absurd. The veteran stood silently, his eyes scanning the room. He had once stood in briefing halls filled with soldiers. Men and women who saluted him, who respected him. Here, though, there were no salutes. Only mocking eyes. No one saw the medals he had earned. No one cared about the flag he had once carried. To them, he was just another man in cuffs. "Sit him down," one officer barked. They shoved him into a hard wooden chair. His wrists ached from the tight metal pressing against his skin. He looked up at the fluorescent lights, blinking against the harsh glow. The smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke filled the air. It was far from the battlefield, yet somehow this room felt more hostile. A young rookie officer walked by, curiosity in his eyes. He glanced at the veteran's ID, which had been tossed carelessly onto the desk. He picked it up and read the name. His eyes widened slightly. He recognized it. It's whispered in history books and military briefings. But before he could say anything, his superior snapped, "Put that down, rookie. Don't waste your time with his stories." The rookie hesitated, then obeyed, placing the ID back down. But the doubt lingered in his eyes. The veteran finally spoke, his voice calm, but heavy with meaning. "I served this country. I wore the uniform with pride. You may laugh, but the proof is in that ID. Those medals in my bag, they are not lies." One of the older officers scoffed. "Medals? You expect us to believe a man like you has medals? Maybe you bought them at a pawn shop. Maybe you tell stories to make yourself feel important." The room erupted in cruel laughter. The veteran did not flinch. His face remained steady. His silence became louder than their mockery. The arresting officer leaned closer, sneering, "If you're really a soldier, where's your respect now? Where are your connections, your big military friends? You're here in cuffs, same as any criminal." His words dripped with arrogance. His voice echoed across the precinct. The veteran's jaw tightened, his eyes burned, but he kept his calm. He had faced enemy fire without flinching. He would not let these men see his pain. He spoke slowly, each word steady. Respect is not given by men like you. It is earned on the battlefield. It is carried in the blood of those who fell beside me. You may call me a liar, but I know the truth. The laughter faltered for a moment. His words cut deeper than they expected. A silence spread for a few seconds before another officer broke it with a mocking laugh. Oh, listen to him. All dramatic. Maybe he's rehearsing for a movie role. The others laughed again. But this time, their voices carried less confidence. The rookie officer's eyes flickered back to the veteran. Something inside him told him the man was not lying. He had seen that look before in the eyes of his own grandfather, who had served decades earlier. It was the look of someone who had faced horrors that could not be faked. He stayed quiet, but his unease grew. Meanwhile, the veteran sat quietly, his hands cuffed, his back straight. He let them laugh, let them spit their words of disrespect, but inside, he knew something they didn't. He knew the weight of his name. He knew that when the right people heard what had happened, these men's arrogance would crumble. One of the officers walked over and grabbed the veteran's sack from where it had been dropped on the floor. He shook it roughly, the sound of metal clinking inside. He smirked. What's this? Junk. Old trophies. He pulled it open, pulling out a cloth bundle. Inside were medals shining even in the dull precinct light. Purple Heart, Silver Star, ribbons of honor. The room fell silent for a moment. But instead of respect, the officer laughed. Oh. So he does have some shiny toys. Doesn't mean they're his. Anyone could steal these. He tossed the medals carelessly back into the bag. The veteran's eyes darkened, his lips pressed tight. He had carried those medals through fire and blood. And now they lay tossed like garbage. The crowd of officers went back to their mockery. Some shaking their heads, some muttering insults under their breath. Crazy old man thinks he's special. Should be grateful we don't lock him up for good. Their words filled the air, heavy and cruel, yet through it all, the veteran remained silent. He stared at the wall, his mind not on their insults, but on the faces of his brothers in arms. The ones who never made it home. He thought of their sacrifice, their respect, their honor, and in that silence, he found strength. What none of the officers realized was that the outside world was already watching. The bystanders' video was spreading online, reaching veterans groups, military networks, and eventually high-ranking officials. The seeds of their downfall had already been planted. But for now, in that moment, the precinct was filled only with arrogance, disrespect, and the sound of men laughing at someone they could never truly understand. And the veteran, sitting quietly, in chains, waited because he knew storms always come when the sky is clear. And this storm was already on its way. The night dragged on inside the precinct. The veteran sat in the hard wooden chair, his wrists still bound, his medals shoved carelessly back into his sack. Around him, the laughter of the officers still echoed, though less bold than before. Their words were sharp, their eyes filled with mockery, but deep inside, a shadow of doubt had already begun to creep in. Yet arrogance is a heavy mask, and they wore it proudly. Instead of admitting their mistake, the officers doubled down. One of them leaned against the desk, arms crossed, smirking. You know what I think? I think you're just another liar. Maybe you stole those medals. Maybe you bought them online. But you're not a real veteran. Not to me. His words drew more chuckles from his colleagues. The veteran stayed quiet. His calm silence seemed to bother them more than any words could. He looked at the clock on the wall, its second hand ticking slowly. Every sound of the tick reminded him of patience, of battles where he had to wait in silence. Every tick brought him closer to the storm he knew was coming. Finally, One officer slapped the desk. "Enough of this, let's book him." The words rolled through the room. The others nodded, laughing. "Yeah, let's put our hero in a cell," they jeered. Two guards grabbed him by the arms and pulled him to his feet. His hands tightened into fists for a moment, but he quickly released them. He would not fight, not here, not yet. They dragged him down the hallway, the sound of their boots echoing against the cold floor. The walls were painted dull gray, the kind of color that swallowed hope. The air smelled of sweat, old paper, and metal. The veteran's steps were steady. He did not stumble. He walked as though he chose to move, not as though they forced him. That quiet defiance unsettled the guards. As they passed a row of desks, a few younger officers watched. Some laughed, shaking their heads. Another troublemaker. One muttered, but others fell silent, staring at the calmness in his eyes. Something about the way he carried himself did not match the picture of a criminal. Something about him demanded respect. Even in chains, the guards opened a steel door and pushed him inside a holding cell. The sound of the lock clanging shut echoed through the small space. The room was bare, just concrete walls, a bench, and the cold floor. The veteran sat down slowly, resting his back against the wall, his hands still cuffed, his face still calm outside the cell. The officers laughed again. There he is, the big hero in his castle. One sneered. Another added, "Let's see how long his story lasts when nobody's listening." Their laughter faded as they walked away, leaving him alone in the silence of the cell. The veteran took a slow breath. His eyes scanned the room. Be the chipped paint, the rust on the bars, the dim light flickering overhead. None of it broke his spirit. He had spent nights in foxholes, hearing enemy fire above him. He had slept on battlefields with nothing but dirt for a pillow. This cell, cold and empty as it was, could not break him. He closed his eyes for a moment, memories flashing. In his mind, the roar of helicopters, the cries of men calling for medics, the heavy weight of carrying wounded soldiers to safety. He remembered the flag draped over coffins, the salutes, the silence of loss. These memories were carved into him like scars. They reminded him of who he was, of what he had given, and now, here he was, locked up like a criminal, disrespected by men who had never stepped onto a battlefield. The bitterness stung, but it did not crush him. Instead, it gave him strength. He knew the truth of his life, and he knew the truth would rise. Meanwhile, in the lobby of the precinct, the video of his arrest had already begun to spread. The bystanders who had recorded the scene outside uploaded it online. Within minutes, veterans groups began sharing it. The comment sections filled with anger, disbelief, and calls for justice. Screens lit up across the country. People watching as a man who had once served with honor was shoved into a police car, mocked and cuffed for nothing but walking home. Back in the cell, the veteran heard the faint buzz of a television from the officer's lounge. A news anchor's voice drifted down the hallway. Breaking news footage has surfaced of a decorated veteran being wrongfully detained by local police. The words were muffled, but he caught enough to know. His story was no longer contained within these walls. The officers returned later, their arrogance still burning, but their laughter quieter now. They tried to mask their unease with more insults, comfortable in there. One jeered, "Don't worry, we'll find a nice long charge for you." Another laughed, but the sound was hollow. Forced, the veteran opened his eyes, looked straight at them, and spoke with quiet strength. "Every insult you throw, every laugh you give it will come back to you. I fought for this country, and this country will hear me again, louder than you can imagine, for the first time." The officers didn't laugh. His words carried a weight they couldn't dismiss. His voice echoed in the silence of the hallway. Lingering long after they walked away, he leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes once more. His wrists hurt. His body was tired, but his spirit was unbroken. He was no ordinary man sitting. In that cell, he was a soldier, a fighter, a survivor. And though they didn't know it yet, the world outside was already moving. The Pentagon was already watching. The unjust detainment had begun as a mockery, but it was about to turn into something far greater. The same men who laughed would soon face the weight of their mistake, and the veteran, sitting calmly in his cell, waited for the moment when their arrogance would collapse under the truth. Asterisk, the cell door clanged shut again, and the veteran sat in the silence. His wrists still bore the marks of the cuffs, red lines pressed into his skin. He shifted slightly on the cold bench but never lowered his head. For him, dignity was not a uniform he could take off. It was something carved into him through years of service. Hours passed slowly. The officers outside carried on with their chatter, laughter, and paperwork. Some walked past his cell to throw another mocking glance. Others ignored him, pretending he wasn't even there. To them, he was just another man in the system. But behind those bars sat someone who carried stories that could silence every laugh. Finally, one of the senior officers came down the hall. Holding the sack they had taken from him earlier, he dragged it carelessly, the metals inside clinking against each other. "So, old man," the officer sneered, "you said you're a veteran. Let's hear your fairy tale. Which war were you supposedly in?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm. The veteran looked at him with calm eyes. "Not supposedly," he said firmly. "I fought in real wars. I bled in them. I lost brothers in them." His voice was not loud, but it filled the small room with... "Wait," the officer laughed, shaking his head. "Everybody's a hero these days, right? Why don't you tell me some of these glorious stories of yours? Maybe you'll win yourself a medal from me." The sarcasm was sharp, but the veteran remained steady. Slowly, he began to speak. "Afghanistan, Iraq, places you've only read about in newspapers. I was there." His voice carried a haunting calm. "I was there when bombs fell from the sky. I was there when bullets tore through the night. I carried wounded men across fields while fire rained down on us. I held dying brothers in my arms as they whispered their last words. I saluted coffins draped in the flag, more coffins than you could count." The officer's smirk faded slightly. He had expected begging, not stories laced with truth. The veteran's words carried too much detail, too much pain, to be lies. The veteran continued, his eyes distant as memories washed over him. "I wore the uniform not for glory, but for duty. I stood in deserts with nothing but sand and silence around me. I stood in jungles where every step could be my last. I stood in towns where children cried for peace that never came." He paused, his voice heavy, "And when my service ended, I returned home with scars you cannot see, scars that no medal can heal." A few younger officers had gathered nearby, listening. Their earlier laughter had died, replaced with uneasy silence. One of them whispered to another, "He's not lying." You can hear it in his voice. The rookie who had recognized his name earlier stepped closer, his eyes wide with realization. "Wait," the rookie said suddenly. "Your name it's on the wall, isn't it? The Hall of Honor at the Pentagon." The other officers turned sharply. Shocked by his words, the veteran met the rookie's gaze and nodded slowly. "Yes, my name is there, etched in stone. Not because I wanted it, but because I earned it." The room fell silent. The arrogance of the senior officers cracked like glass under a heavy stone. They exchanged uneasy looks. Some shook their heads, refusing to believe. But others felt the truth settle heavily on their shoulders. The veteran leaned forward, his eyes sharp now. "You call me a liar, a fraud, a beggar. But while you sit here mocking men like me, remember the Psy fought for your right to wear that badge. I fought for your right to laugh, and this is how you repay me. With cuffs and insults." His words were like fire, searing through their pride. The rookie officer looked pale. "Sir," he whispered, "if this is true, why didn't you tell them sooner?" The veteran's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. "I shouldn't have to prove my worth. The uniform I wore, the scars I carry, the brothers I buried, that is proof enough." One of the older officers scoffed again, trying to hold on to his pride. "Even if you are who you say, it doesn't matter. You're sitting in a cell now. You're nobody here." The veteran's eyes narrowed. His voice grew quiet. But every word struck like thunder. "Nobody," he said. "A nobody doesn't have his name carved into the walls of the Pentagon. A nobody doesn't have generals who know his face. A nobody doesn't carry secrets of missions you will never hear about." The officers froze. A chill swept through the hallway. They had mocked him as an ordinary man. But now the truth was unfolding, piece by piece. His story was no longer one of a crazy liar. It was one of service, sacrifice, an honor too great to be ignored, the rookie whispered. "Again, sir. You were part of Operation Iron Shield, weren't you?" The veteran closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. His silence was an answer louder than any words. The rookie stepped back, stunned. That operation was still spoken of in quiet circles, its details classified, and the man they had locked up in a holding cell had been at its heart. The senior officer tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "Stories, that's all they are." But his eyes betrayed his fear. He knew the rookie was right. He knew the man in the cell was more than he seemed. The veteran leaned back against the wall, his voice calm again. "I am not here to beg for your respect. Respect cannot be forced. It is given by those who understand sacrifice. You do not understand, but others will, and when they come, you will see the weight of your mistakes." The officer shifted uneasily. The sack with his medals sat on the desk like a silent witness. The air was heavy with the truth they had tried so hard to deny, and deep inside, each of them knew the man they had laughed at, mocked, and chained was no ordinary stranger. He was a hero whose name was written in history. And soon, the world outside would know it too. The night outside the precinct was no longer quiet. The flashing red and blue lights still painted the streets. But now they shone against dozens of phones held high in the air. The bystanders who had witnessed the arrest hadn't just watched, they had recorded. From the moment the veteran was handcuffed, to the cruel words, to the sight of his medals being tossed like trash, it was all captured. One young woman stood near a lamppost, her hands shaking as she pressed upload. Her video was only 3 minutes long, but it carried more truth than hours of speeches ever could. Within minutes, it spread across social media. "Black veteran detained by police." The caption? Read. Her words were simple, but her anger was clear. People across the city saw it first, then the state, then the country. Comments exploded beneath the video. "Is this real? A war hero treated like this? My father served this, makes me sick. Those cops need to be fired immediately." Hashtags formed within the hour. Veterans groups began sharing the footage. Civil rights activists demanded answers. The video spread like wildfire, reaching millions before dawn. Each share carried with it outrage. Each comment carried fury. Inside the precinct, the officers were unaware at first. They laughed and joked. Pouring coffee, writing reports, they thought the man in the cell was forgotten. Just another name in the system, but outside their walls, the world was changing. The rookie officer, uneasy since hearing the veteran's name, checked his phone during a break. His eyes widened as he scrolled. The video was everywhere. Thousands of people were already calling for justice. His hands trembled. He realized this was no longer a local matter. It was a national storm. He whispered to himself, "It's already out." By midnight, the story was on news feeds. Television anchors spoke urgently. "Breaking news tonight. Footage of a decorated veteran being wrongfully detained by police has gone viral, sparking outrage across the country. Clips of the video played on screen showing the veteran's calm face as he said, "I fought for this country, and this is how you treat me." Those words hit harder than any headline in homes across America. Families watched in disbelief. Veterans who had served in wars sat stunned, fists clenched. Some wept quietly, remembering their own sacrifices. Others called their comrades, spreading the news faster than fire. Veterans associations issued public statements within hours. "We demand accountability," one leader said. "This is not just an insult to one man, but to every man and woman who has served at military bases." Whispers spread quickly. Soldiers gathered around screens, watching the video again and again. Some slammed their fists into tables. Furious at the disrespect, others stood in silence, their eyes dark with anger. They knew the man in the video, not all by face, but by reputation. His name carried weight in the military community, and now the world was seeing him humiliated. Meanwhile, the precinct remained blind. Their arrogance shielded them from reality. The senior officer chuckled as he leaned back in his chair. "He'll be forgotten by morning," he said confidently, but the rookie shook his head. "No, he won't." His voice was quiet, but firm. At dawn, the story hit national television. Major networks broadcasted the clip. Talk show hosts opened their programs with the veteran's words. Hashtags trended at #1 worldwide. Protesters began gathering outside the precinct, carrying signs, "Respect our veterans. Justice now, and never forget who fought for you." The officers inside the station grew uneasy as the crowd grew louder. Chants echoed through the streets. "Justice for the veteran! Justice for the veteran!" Windows rattled with the sound of voices demanding answers. For the first time, the precinct felt small. Trapped in the shadow of its own mistakes, inside his cell, the veteran sat calmly. He could hear the faint rumble of the crowd outside, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew he had waited. He had warned them, and now? The voices of the people were rising louder than the insults of a few arrogant men. The rookie officer approached the cell quietly. His face pale. "Sir, your video, it's everywhere," he whispered. "The whole country knows now. They're outside. They're demanding justice." His voice trembled with both fear and respect. The veteran looked at him steadily and gave a slow nod. "I told them," he said softly. "The truth always rises." The senior officers tried to keep control. They barked orders, locked doors, and told everyone to ignore the noise. But their confidence cracked when the phone rang. The chief answered, his face turning white as he listened. The call wasn't from City Hall or the mayor. It was from higher, far higher. The Pentagon had seen the video. In Washington, D.C., military leaders gathered around screens. Their faces were grim. They recognized the man instantly. His name wasn't just carved into a wall of honor. It was written in reports, in classified files. In history itself, he wasn't just a veteran. He was a soldier whose missions had saved lives, a man whose bravery had shaped battles. The phone lines lit up. The Pentagon demanded answers. Who authorized this detainment? They asked sharply. How could this happen? The local authorities stammered, unprepared. Their arrogance collapsed into panic. Back at the precinct, the crowd outside swelled. News vans arrived. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras zoomed in on the building where the man sat in chains. Inside, the officers realized the world was no longer laughing with them. The world was pointing at them, and in the quiet of his cell, the veteran closed his eyes. He could feel the tide turning. The same men who had mocked him hours before were now drowning in fear. Their disrespect was no longer hidden in four walls. Was broadcast to millions, and justice, once ignored, was now marching toward them with unstoppable force. The video had gone viral, and with it, the first cracks in the walls of the precinct had begun to appear. The precinct buzzed with nervous energy. The laughter of a few hours ago had disappeared, replaced by whispers, hurried phone calls, and uneasy glances outside. The crowd had grown into hundreds. Protesters waved flags. Veterans wore their uniforms with pride. Families held signs demanding justice. News cameras zoomed in, capturing every chant and every angry voice. Inside his cell, the veteran sat calmly, his hands resting on his knees. His face was steady, his eyes unshaken. He had seen storms before on battlefields where life and death clashed. But this storm felt different. It wasn't bullets or bombs. It was truth breaking down walls. And he knew it was only the beginning. Suddenly, the phones in the precinct rang again and again. Officers answered, but their voices cracked under the weight of the calls. Reporters demanded statements. City officials shouted questions. Lawyers called for immediate release. But the call that silenced the room came from Washington. The precinct chief picked up the receiver. His hand trembled as he heard the words on the other end. "This is the Pentagon." The voice was firm, unshakable. "We are aware of the situation at your precinct involving one of our veterans. Stand by for federal intervention." The chief's face turned pale. He hung up the phone slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming." Within hours, black SUVs rolled down the street. Their tinted windows reflected the flashing lights and the shouting crowd. The vehicles stopped in front of the precinct, and men and women in sharp suits stepped out. They were not ordinary officials. Their badges carried the seal of the Department of Defense. Behind them came uniformed military police. Their boots hit the pavement with the same precision that echoed on parade grounds. The crowd roared louder, cheering justice for the veteran. Reporters shouted questions as cameras flashed. The atmosphere burned with tension. The local officers inside peered nervously through the blinds. Their arrogance drained into fear. The doors of the precinct swung open, and the federal agents marched in. Their presence filled the room with authority. The senior officer who had mocked the veteran earlier stepped forward, trying to sound confident. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded. One agent flashed his badge sharply. "We're here under direct orders from the Pentagon. Step aside." His voice was calm, but carried the weight of command that none of the local officers could challenge. The agents went straight to the holding cells. Their footsteps echoed down the hallway. The rookie officer followed, his heart pounding. He had believed the veteran all along. And now the truth was marching in beside him. When they reached the cell, the veteran stood up slowly, his posture straightened, his calm eyes meeting theirs. One of the agents saluted him immediately. "Sir, we're here to take you home." The crowd of officers who had gathered in the hallway froze. Their jaws dropped, a salute inside their own precinct to the man they had laughed at hours earlier. The veteran returned the salute with quiet dignity. His voice was steady. "Took you long enough," he said. But there was no bitterness, only a calm strength. The agent ordered the guard. "Open the door." The guard hesitated, looking to his superiors. But the agent's glare silenced all doubt. The key turned, the door swung open, and the veteran stepped out. His cuffs were removed, the marks on his wrists were visible. Red lines etched deep into his skin. The sight made the rookie clench his fists in anger as the veteran walked out. The federal agents surrounded him, not as captors, but as protectors. The hallway that had once echoed with insults now stood silent. The officers who had mocked him earlier avoided his eyes. Shame burned their faces. Their laughter had turned into fear. One agent pulled out a document stamped with the Pentagon seal. He handed it to the precinct chief by order of the Department of Defense. "This precinct is under federal investigation. All operations are suspended until further notice." The chief's hands shook as he held the paper. His lips moved, but no words came out. The news spread instantly. Reporters outside shouted in too. Cameras, breaking news. The Pentagon has stepped in. Federal agents have taken control of the precinct after the wrongful detainment of a decorated veteran. The crowd erupted in cheers. Veterans in the crowd saluted as the man walked out of the building, his head held high. The veteran paused on the steps, looking at the sea of people for the first time in years. He felt the weight of respect return not from the officers who had mocked him, but from the people who understood his sacrifice. His story was no longer hidden. His truth was no longer doubted. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Officers scrambled as federal investigators opened files, seized computers, and questioned staff. The same men who had laughed hours earlier now sat with pale faces, their careers crumbling before their eyes. One whispered to another, "We're finished." The veteran, however, did not look back at them. He walked forward, each step steady. His sack was returned to him. His medal safely inside, he held it close, not out of weakness, but out of pride. The Pentagon's intervention had changed everything. This was no longer just a wrongful detainment, was a reckoning. The officers' arrogance had been shattered, their precinct stripped of power. The man they had mocked was now the symbol of justice, and though he remained calm, his presence spoke louder than any words. He was a soldier once again, not on the battlefield, but in the fight for dignity. His story had become a lesson for the nation. The Pentagon had stepped in, and the world was watching. The precinct that once rang with laughter was now filled with silence and fear. The federal agents moved like shadows through every hallway, opening filing cabinets, seizing computers, pulling stacks of reports into evidence boxes. What had been the center of power for the local cops only hours ago now looked like a crime. Seen under investigation, the officers who had mocked the veteran sat stiffly at their desks. Their arrogance gone, sweat dripped from their foreheads as agents questioned them one by one. Who authorized the detainment? Who signed the arrest? Report. Why was a decorated veteran placed in a cell without cause? The questions hit like hammer blows. Every word they had spoken earlier, insult. Every cruel laugh now weighed heavily on their shoulders. The precinct chief tried to maintain control, pacing the lobby with his arms crossed. "This is unnecessary," he muttered to one agent. "We were just doing our jobs." But the agent slammed a folder onto the desk, his voice sharp. "Your job was to protect citizens. Instead, you humiliated a man who once protected you." The chief's mouth opened, but no words came out. In another room, the arresting officers were seated across from federal investigators. The arrogance that had once dripped from their voices was gone, replaced with stammers and excuses. We thought he was lying," one muttered. "He looked suspicious." The investigator's cold stare silenced him. "Suspicion is not evidence. And your words were not only unprofessional, they were unlawful." The rookie officer stood in the corner, silent. His hands shook slightly, not from fear of punishment, but from the heavy truth that had been revealed. He had known from the start that the veteran was different, that his calm eyes carried stories too deep to be lies. Now, watching the senior officers crumble under questioning, he felt both relief and anger. Relief that the truth had risen. Anger that it had taken humiliation and public shame for them to see it. Outside, the protests grew louder. Chants echoed through the streets. "Shut it down. Shut it down." Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, their voices united. Some held pictures of their own fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who had served. They shouted not just for one man, but for the dignity of all who had sacrificed. News cameras captured everything. Broadcasters reported live. The Pentagon has placed the precinct under investigation. Sources confirm that charges may be filed against multiple officers. The nation watched as the story unfolded in real time, and sympathy for the veteran turned into outrage against the precinct. Back inside, one of the officers who had laughed, the loudest earlier, now sat with his head in his hands. His career, once untouchable, was slipping away. Another officer whispered, "They'll fire us, maybe even charge us." His voice trembled. The weight of regret hung heavy in the air. Then the announcement came. A federal official stepped into the center of the lobby, his voice firm and commanding. By order of the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice, this precinct is officially suspended from operation until further notice. All officers are to surrender their weapons and badges for review. Those directly involved in the wrongful detainment of the veteran will face disciplinary hearings and possible criminal charges. The words struck like thunder. Gasps filled the room. Officers exchanged stunned looks. Some argued, some pleaded. But their voices were drowned by the authority in the official's tone. One by one, officers began placing their service weapons and badges onto the desk. Their hands shook as the symbols of their power were stripped away. The veteran, standing in the lobby now surrounded by federal agents, watched quietly. His eyes did not show joy, only a calm, steady weight. He had not asked for revenge, only respect. Yet watching the precinct crumble, he felt a quiet justice in the air, a justice that came not from anger, but from truth.